Every day for 10 years, Max sat by the same door. He didn't bark. He didn't chase squirrels anymore. He just waited. People walked past him. The seasons changed, but Max never moved. This is not just a story about a dog. This is a story about memory, love, and the kind of loyalty only a dog could hold for a child who never came home. There was nothing particularly special about the door at 7 Hawthorne Lane. It was painted a muted sea glass green, faded by sun and salt wind over the years. The brass handle, once polished and shiny, had long turned a dull bronze, worn smooth by time and familiarity. A little welcome mat sat before it, frayed and weather-stained but still intact, and just beside that mat lay Max. Every morning at precisely 7:15 a.m., the old golden retriever would settle into his spot, his soft eyes trained on the horizon like a sentry at post. Every afternoon at 3:15 p.m. he would rise, just slightly, ears perked, tail swishing. Once or twice, anticipation flooding his tired limbs. But no one ever came. Neighbors had begun to whisper about it long ago. Kids riding bikes along the sidewalk would slow down when they passed. Mailmen would drop letters quietly, almost respectfully, as if stepping onto sacred ground. Some even claimed that Max hadn't moved in all these years, that he didn't bark, didn't eat, just existed, a guardian of something only he still remembered. But Max hadn't always been this way. 10 years ago, the house on Hawthorne Lane had been filled with life. Laughter echoed through its rooms, songs drifted from the kitchen, and in the backyard, a little girl with a high ponytail and scraped knees named Sophie would chase her best friend, Max, around the oak tree over and over until both collapsed in the grass. Max had come into the Andrews family on a warm summer afternoon. Sophie had just turned 7. Her mother, Marlene, had resisted the idea of a pet for years. Too much mess, too much work, too many unknowns. But Sophie's father, Daniel, had grown up with dogs and saw the way his daughter's face lit up when she passed one in the park. So, one Saturday, he brought home a wiggling, wide-eyed golden pup wrapped in a blue blanket, and Sophie's world shifted forever. The moment she laid eyes on Max, she dropped her new birthday doll, letting it tumble forgotten to the porch. "Is he mine?" she asked, her hands covering her mouth. "Really mine?" "He's ours," Daniel said, smiling. "But I think he's been waiting for you." And so Max entered the world of 7 Hawthorne Lane like a sunbeam through a dusty window, quiet but brilliant. He chewed on every shoe in the house, had a habit of knocking over flower pots, and never quite learned not to chase the neighbor's cat. But he was gentle, obedient, fiercely loyal, and always near Sophie. If she was brushing her teeth, Max was curled up on the bath mat. If she was reading, he lay beneath her bed. If she cried, he licked her face until she laughed. And every day, when Sophie left for school, Max would walk with her to the curb, sit patiently, and wait until the bus took her around the corner. Then he would trot back inside, only to be right there again at 3:15 when the brakes of the school bus squealed at the top of the street. Rain or shine, Max was there. He became her shadow, her protector, her heart. But then came the day that broke the world in two. It was a Tuesday, one of those sharp gray spring mornings where the air still holds a bite of winter. Sophie had slept late and forgotten her lunch. Daniel had already left for work, and Marlene was rushing around the house trying to get Sophie dressed, fed, and out the door in time for the bus. Max knew something was off. He always did. He whined softly at the door, pawing it with anxiety as Sophie shrugged on her jacket and grabbed her backpack. Marlene scolded him gently. "Not now, Max, we're late," and pushed Sophie out the door with a quick kiss. But the lunchbox sat abandoned on the counter, and just 5 minutes later, when Marlene realized it, guilt bloomed. Sophie hated school lunches. She had sensitive stomach issues. and she'd been so excited about the special sandwich they'd made together the night before. Without thinking, Marlene threw on a sweater, grabbed her keys, and yelled to Max, "You stay here." "Boy, I'll be back in 5. She never got the chance. It wasn't anyone's fault. That's what the officers said. The driver hadn't seen her. The rain had blurred the windshield. Marlene's tires had slipped just slightly as she turned onto the main road. It was a freak accident, a one-in-a-million moment, the kind that changes everything. Sophie's lunchbox was still clutched in her mother's hand when they found her. Max sat at the door that afternoon just like always. His ears twitched when the bus brakes hissed at the corner. His eyes scanned the sidewalk. His tail lifted, then stilled. No Sophie. That night, Daniel came home without his wife, without his daughter, just silence and Max waiting by the door. Days passed. Neighbors dropped off casseroles. Flowers piled on the porch. Daniel barely spoke. He drifted through the house like a ghost. Sometimes he sat beside Max, his hand resting on the dog's back as they both stared at the door. Other times he wandered upstairs and sat in Sophie's room, smelling her clothes, staring at the crayon drawings she'd taped to the wall. Max kept his vigil. The 3:15 ritual never faltered, even when Daniel stopped going to work. Even when the house grew dim and cold and quiet. Even when Daniel moved away, yes, Daniel left. Not out of abandonment, but survival. A year after the accident, Daniel packed up what little he could stomach to touch and rented a small apartment downtown. He told the neighbors he needed to start over, that he couldn't breathe inside those walls anymore. But when it came time to take Max, something strange happened. The dog wouldn't budge. He whined. He scratched the front door. He refused to get into the car. And for the first time, Daniel realized Max wasn't waiting for him. He was waiting for her. "I think he's guarding her," Daniel said softly to the woman next door. "I know. That sounds crazy, but I can't take that away from him." So Max stayed. The house sat mostly empty. Daniel hired a local groundskeeper to keep the yard tidy, left bowls of food and water under the porch, and visited on Sundays to restock supplies. But Max didn't follow him, didn't even acknowledge him beyond a brief glance. He had a job to do, and he would not abandon it. Word spread slowly at first. Kids walking home from school began to notice him. Same place, same time. Then a local dog walker posted about Max on social media. The post read, "There's a dog on Hawthorne Lane who waits by a door every day at 3:15 p.m. No leash, no owner, just waiting. For years. Does anyone know his story?" The replies poured in. By the end of the week, Max had quietly become a local legend. Some brought treats. Others sat with him in silence. Children drew pictures and left them on the porch. Someone even wrote a song and played it on guitar beside him one golden autumn afternoon. Max remained still, eyes on the horizon, always waiting. And through it, the door never opened, not for Sophie, not for Marlene. But Max didn't know that. All he knew was that one day, someone had left. And love had never given him permission to stop hoping. The second spring after Sophie's disappearance, the house at 7 Hawthorne Lane looked mostly the same, but life around it had changed. Max, the silent sentinel, had become more than a neighborhood curiosity. He was a symbol. A kind of quiet strength that people couldn't quite explain but felt drawn toward. News had spread beyond the block, beyond the city. One chilly April afternoon, a woman with dark curls and wide, uncertain eyes sat down on the bench across the street from the house. She wore a navy raincoat and held a notebook in her lap. She didn't pet Max. She didn't speak. She simply watched. Max didn't look at her. He was used to strangers now, people passing through, stopping for a moment, offering kind words or food. Some knelt, Some cried, some took photos or left hand-drawn sketches on the porch. But this woman didn't do any of that. She just came back, every day, same time, same place, silent, watching. Her name was Lily. She was a writer, or had been, before the accident, before everything she thought she knew about love and loss had unraveled. Her husband had died 2 years earlier. Cancer, swift and unrelenting, and ever since, she had wandered, notebook in hand, trying to find words again. That's how she found Max. She had been passing through the town on her way north when she stopped at a cafe. The barista told her about the dog on Hawthorne Lane, like one might talk about a town legend, half in awe, half in reverence. She didn't expect much. She'd seen memorials before, people clinging to grief in strange ways. But then she saw Max, and everything changed. There was something sacred about the way he waited. Not desperate, not loud, just constant, like a lighthouse, fixed in the dark. Lily found herself returning the next day, then the next. Soon she brought her notebook. She began writing. Not stories, not fiction, but observations, fragments, thoughts. Today, he didn't flinch when the wind knocked over the trash bin. His eyes never moved from that corner. He knows something I don't. What is love, if not this? She didn't tell anyone about it. It felt too personal, as if she was intruding on something holy. Still, she came. One rainy afternoon in late May, Lily finally approached the porch. Max was curled in his usual spot, ears down, tail resting flat against the mat. His coat was soaked, but he didn't move. Lily knelt a few feet away. "Hi, Max," she said softly. He didn't blink. "I know you don't know me, but I think I understand." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. On it, a sketch. Max sitting at the door, the shadow of a little girl faintly outlined behind the glass. "I drew this for you," she whispered. Then gently she placed the paper on the porch step beside him and stood to leave. For the first time in weeks, Max turned his head. Lily stopped. Their eyes met. For just a second, she could have sworn she saw something deeper than instinct. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. Max laid his head back down, but Lily felt it in her bones. She'd been accepted. Over the weeks that followed, Lily began visiting earlier each day. She cleaned the porch steps, left fresh water bowls, even coaxed a few bristles through Max's fur when he allowed it. And slowly, she wrote. The story of Max began to take shape, not as folklore, but as something painfully real. A child, a tragedy, a dog who refused to forget. She emailed a local magazine editor on a whim. Subject line, "The dog who waits at the door." The editor replied in 2 hours. He wanted the story. Lily spent the next 3 days refining every sentence. She poured her heart into it, her grief, her wonder, her respect for Max. She refused to dramatize. She only wrote what she saw. When the EWI article was published, it exploded, not just in the town, but across the country. People from other states wrote letters. Truck drivers rerouted their trips just to pass Hawthorne Lane. A group of school children from Iowa made "Thank You Max" bracelets and mailed them in boxes with dog treats. Max's porch became a shrine, not of sorrow, but of unwavering hope. But with attention came questions, and with questions came change. One morning, a white van pulled up across from the house. 2 men in gray jackets stepped out holding clipboards. A small group of reporters had gathered nearby, whispering about animal control and abandoned property. Lily watched from the bench, her stomach sinking. She rose, crossing the street quickly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm. "Can I help you?" The taller man glanced up. "You live here?" "No," she replied, "but I'm with him." She motioned toward Max, who hadn't moved. "We received multiple reports. the man said. This dog's been left unsupervised for years. He's not unsupervised, Lily replied. He's waiting. That doesn't mean it's safe, the other man added. There are liability concerns. Lily's heart pounded. He's not a stray. He has food, shelter, and a community that looks after him. Still, the first man said, someone needs to take responsibility. That night, Lily made a decision. She drove downtown, knocked on an apartment door she'd never seen before, and waited. Daniel opened it, blinking in surprise. "Can I talk to you about Max?" she asked. Daniel hadn't spoken about Max in months, not because he didn't care, but because it hurt too much. He hadn't read Lily's article. He hadn't seen the viral photos. In some small corner of his mind, he had sealed off the pain, left it behind with the sea glass green door. But now it was in front of him. "I think you should come see him," Lily said. He hesitated. And then he did. The next morning, as the 3:15 bus hissed at the corner of Hawthorne Lane, Max sat up, just as he always did. But this time someone stood beside him. Daniel. His eyes were wet, his face was pale, but he looked down at Max with awe. "He's still here," Daniel whispered. Max turned toward him. Something flickered. Recognition. Faint. Fuzzy. But real. Daniel knelt. "I'm sorry, buddy," he said. "I should have come sooner." Max rested his head in Daniel's lap, and for the first time in 10 years, the door at 7 Hawthorne Lane opened, not for Sophie, but for the man who had loved her just as much, and Max followed him inside. The door creaked open slowly. It had been nearly a decade since anyone truly stepped inside 7 Hawthorne Lane. Daniel's hand trembled as he turned the knob, the brass cold against his skin. Max stood behind him, unmoving, ears perked, breath silent, like a soldier returning to the battlefield. The air inside was thick, still, and stale. Dust clung to the furniture like a protective layer, shielding forgotten memories. The once bright walls were faded and yellowed with time. But beneath the cobwebs and silence, the house still pulsed with the life that once filled it. Max stepped over the threshold first, and the moment his paws touched the worn wooden floor, something changed. He moved with slow certainty, sniffing. The floorboards, padding softly toward the hallway where Sophie used to dance with her glitter-covered sneakers. The wallpaper was peeling at the edges. One of the picture frames lay crooked on the wall, still holding that frozen image of Sophie, Daniel, and her mother Emily on the beach, all smiles and sunburned noses. Daniel swallowed hard. His footsteps echoed louder than he expected, reverberating through the emptiness. It felt like the house was watching, waiting, asking where they had all gone. He followed Max into the living room. The couch was still there, covered in an old floral sheet. Sophie's toy bin sat in the corner, half emptied, as if someone had paused in the middle of cleaning and never returned. Then Daniel noticed it. Near the back of the couch, right next to the fireplace, the dog bed. Faded, torn, but still in the same spot. Max saw it too. He sniffed it once, then stepped around. And sat by the door instead. Daniel sank into the couch and stared at his dog. "You're still waiting," he said quietly. "Even inside the house." Max didn't move. He simply stared at the door as if expecting a knock, a key turning in. The lock, a familiar pair of rain boots stomping inside. It broke Daniel's heart. Later that evening, Lily returned. She knocked softly before stepping in. Daniel hadn't changed much in 10 years, she realized. His face was a little more lined, his eyes more sunken, but the grief that lived in his shoulders carried in his silence. "I brought some food," Lily offered, holding out a paper bag. "For both of you." Daniel gave a tired smile. Max didn't touch the food. Instead, he curled up by the front door once again, his chin resting on the floor, tail flicking slightly, whenever a car passed outside. They sat together on the living room floor, Lily and Daniel, sharing quiet memories and warm soup. "I used to think grief was something you got through," Daniel said. "Like a mountain you had to climb." Lily nodded. "But now," he continued, "I think it's more like a room you live in, and sometimes the windows open, sometimes they close." He paused. "And sometimes the dog stays by the door." In the following days, Daniel and Lily began to slowly breathe life back into the house. They opened the windows, swept the floors, planted daisies in the backyard, where Sophie used to chase butterflies. Max watched it all without much change. He would sniff the edges of the new rugs, circle around fresh paint, accept a treat now and then, but always at the same time each afternoon, he returned to the door, as though keeping a promise. One morning, Daniel found an old shoebox in Sophie's closet. Inside were photos, crayon drawings, and a wrinkled pink scarf that still smelled faintly of strawberry shampoo. At the bottom of the box was a note folded in a childish square. "If anything ever happens, don't be sad. I'll be with the clouds. I love you, Daddy. Love, Sophie and Max." Daniel read the note twice, then a third time. He hadn't known Sophie had written that, hadn't known she'd thought about what if, but somehow she had. He walked into the hallway and sat beside Max. "I miss her too, boy," he whispered. "I always have." Max leaned into him gently. That night, Daniel had a dream. In it, he saw Sophie, older but unmistakably her. She stood by the door, arms open, sunlight pouring behind her like golden syrup. Max ran to her. She knelt and laughed as he nuzzled into her neck, her arms wrapping around him tight. Then she looked at Daniel. "Thank you," she said. When he woke up, tears clung to his cheeks. And Max? Max was at the window this time, as if looking up at the sky. 1 week later, Lily came by with a camera crew. A major news outlet had picked up the story and wanted to film a feature on Max, the dog who waited a decade. Daniel hesitated at first. "He's not a mascot," he said. "He's a miracle," Lily replied. "And the world needs miracles." So they filmed, quietly, respectfully. They captured Max walking to the door at 3:15 sharp. They recorded Daniel reading Sophie's note. They filmed Lily gently brushing Max's graying coat. They didn't dramatize it. They just told the truth. And the world listened. Within 3 days, the story hit 15 million views. People shared their own stories of grief, of lost pets, of waiting. Messages poured in from Chile, Japan, Norway. Schools started reading Sophie's story during morning announcements. One girl in Wisconsin painted a mural of Max on the side of her school building. It said, "Love always finds a way home." Donations began arriving too, unsolicited. Toys, blankets, treats, even framed portraits. Daniel donated most of it to local shelters, but he kept one item, a hand-knitted collar with the words embroidered, in golden thread. "Good boy forever." He fastened it around Max's neck gently. Max licked his hand. That night, Daniel sat by the fireplace, Max beside him. "I think she'd be proud of you," he said. "Of both of us." He looked out the window where the moonlight blanketed the street. "Maybe it's time," he whispered. Max lifted his head, not at the door, but at Daniel. A beat passed between them, then 2. And then, for the first time in 10 years, Max moved, away from the door. He walked across the room, climbed onto the couch beside Daniel, curled into a ball, and slept. The house was quiet, but the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like peace. Summer arrived gently that year. The town of Willow Creek, once sleepy and overlooked, had transformed into a quiet pilgrimage site. People came not for monuments or museums, but to see a weathered green door and the old dog who had waited, Max. He still made his way to the doorway every day, but now there was a difference. He no longer waited at the door. He waited by it, with the door open. It was Daniel who had opened it one Tuesday in June. He stood on the porch, Max by his side, and looked at the handle. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from release. With a breath, he turned it. The door creaked and stayed open. No more barrier, no more divide. If Sophie were ever to return, Daniel figured, she wouldn't need to knock. From then on, the door remained ajar during daylight. Neighbors would stop and smile when they passed. Tourists lingered quietly, placing flowers on the steps or dog treats in a woven basket someone had left with a sign that read, "In honor of love that waits." Max became more than a symbol. He became a comfort. Children sat beside him. Veterans rested on the porch with him. Grieving widows brought him sandwiches and told him stories of husbands lost long ago. He listened to everyone, and in return, they healed a little more each time they left. Inside the house, Daniel and Lily worked on something new. It was Lily's idea. "A children's book," she said. "For Sophie, for Max, for every person who's ever waited for someone who didn't. Come back." Daniel hesitated. He wasn't sure he could do it. But Lily had seen something in him, a quiet strength, a father's tenderness that still pulsed beneath the years of grief. She encouraged him, sat with him as he sorted through Sophie's notebooks, Max's photos, and the memories that had started to feel less like wounds and more like roots. The story was simple. A little girl who gets lost in a storm. A dog who waits by the door, and a promise that love always finds its way home. They called it The Porch Where Love Waited. Max was, of course, the star. Lily drew the illustrations herself, watercolors filled with warm golden light and soft blue shadows. Each page bled with emotion, but never sorrow. There was something profoundly comforting in those images. The town library offered to host the first reading. Local news stations returned to cover the event, but Daniel insisted it remain small, intimate. About the message, not the moment. Max sat on a cushion beside the reading chair. Children lined the carpet in front of him, wide-eyed and curious. Daniel read the final page aloud. "And though the girl never came back through the door, the dog never left, because some love is so strong. It never stops waiting." The room was silent. Then a little voice spoke. "Did the dog get sad?" Daniel paused. He looked at Max and smiled. "No," he said softly. He remembered. And remembering isn't sad. It's how we keep the people we love close. The children nodded, and one reached out to gently pat Max's fur. Max wagged his tail. Over the following weeks, the book began spreading. Teachers requested copies. Therapists used it for grief counseling. Shelters kept it in their lobbies. People didn't just read the story. They felt it, because it wasn't really about a dog or a porch. It was about them. One Sunday morning, as Daniel sipped coffee on the porch, Max stirred beside him. A black SUV had pulled up at the curb. A woman stepped out, mid-40s, slender, with auburn hair and cautious eyes. She wore a silver chain with a small charm, a paw print. Daniel stood slowly. "Hello," he said. The woman offered a faint smile. "I'm Erin. I'm Sophie's aunt." Daniel blinked. He remembered her now, Emily's sister. They hadn't spoken in years, not since the accident. Grief had a way of scattering people like leaves in a storm. "I read the article," she said, "and the book. I had to see him." She knelt beside Max. He sniffed her hand, then leaned in gently. his eyes soft. "I remember when he was just a puppy," she whispered. They sat on the porch for hours. Aaron told Daniel stories he had forgotten. Sophie's obsession with caterpillars, her favorite bedtime song, how she used to give Max bark commands like, "Spin like spaghetti." They laughed, they cried, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel didn't feel alone in his memories. That evening, Aaron made a quiet offer. "I know a grief center that would love to have Max visit," she said. "He wouldn't have to do anything, just be there." Daniel looked at Max. The old dog was lying peacefully beside the open door, nose twitching in his dreams. "He's done enough waiting," Daniel said. "Maybe it's time he shows others how to remember." The next week, Max visited the Willow Creek Healing Center. The building was quiet, filled with soft light and softer voices. Children painted. Teenagers journaled. Parents sat with counselors. There was a hushed gentleness in every corner. Max moved among them like a ghost of comfort. He didn't bark, didn't whimper, just pressed his head gently against knees, curled, beside feet, and offered his presence like a weighted blanket of understanding. The kids adored him. Some cried. Some smiled. One boy, 8 years old, whose sister had died the year before, rested his head against Max and whispered, "I miss her every day." Max licked his cheek. Word spread. Max became a weekly visitor. He brought no miracles, just warmth. Steadiness, but sometimes that was all someone needed. At home, the porch was never empty. Flowers still arrived daily. Max's photo, now framed in dozens of homes around the country, had become a symbol of devotion. A symbol of hope that even if those we love never return, their memory will always have a place to come back to. And through it all, Daniel healed, not by forgetting Sophie, but by building a life around the love that remained. One August morning, Max didn't rise for breakfast. Daniel found him curled beneath the kitchen window, sunlight dappling his face. He was still breathing, but slower, softer. He knelt beside him. "Hey, old boy," he whispered. "You tired?" Max blinked slowly. Daniel stroked his fur. "You waited long enough," he said. "It's okay." Max sighed, rested his head on Daniel's knee, and slept. The vet came quietly. There were no sirens, no panic, just peace. Max passed as he had lived, gently, with dignity, surrounded by love. And when he was gone, Daniel left the door open one last time. The town held a memorial, not grand, not loud, but full of warmth. Kids drew chalk hearts on the sidewalk. A choir of school children sang Sophie's favorite lullaby. Lily read from the book, and Daniel, standing at the porch, said only this: he waited at this door for 10 years, but in truth, he never waited alone. He waited with love, and in that love, he brought us all home. It had been 1 month since Max passed, but the porch still wasn't empty. The door still stood open, and every morning, Daniel stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee, looked at the space where Max used to sit, and smiled. He no longer waited. He remembered. And somehow, that was enough. The memorial had sparked something larger than anyone expected. Not a movement, not a trend, something quieter, more enduring. It began with letters, hundreds of them, from parents, teachers, children, and strangers. Some sent stories. Others sent sketches, poems, or photos of their own pets who had passed, each wrapped in love, grief, and a little hope. Daniel read everyone. Sometimes Lily helped, sometimes Aaron, but often he read them alone, his fingers tracing the words like braille made of memories. One letter read, "I used to believe that letting go meant forgetting, but your dog taught me that waiting with love is a form of remembering. Thank you, Max." Soon, they had an idea. The Max Foundation. Not a charity, not a corporation, a community project built from grief, healing, and devotion. The mission was simple: to bring comfort animals to people who have experienced profound loss, to create spaces, literal and emotional, where waiting can feel less lonely, to remind the world that some love doesn't end, it just changes shape. The local high school offered space for the headquarters. Volunteers arrived by the dozens: teenagers, retirees, counselors, and even a few veterans. People who had waited, people who had loved and lost, people who understood. They converted an old art classroom into a sanctuary. The walls were covered in Max's photos, drawings from children, and quotes from the book. Love doesn't vanish. It just walks beside us quietly. There was a large reading nook for children, therapy dogs who visited weekly, and a memory wall where visitors could post stories of their own Max. One afternoon, a boy named Jeremy visited the center. He was 11, small for his age, quiet. He clutched a worn photograph of a dog named Pepper. His mother, eyes swollen from recent tears, whispered that Pepper had died in a house fire. Jeremy hadn't spoken much since. Daniel knelt beside him, recognizing the silence not as emptiness, but as something deeper. A pause. A wound still forming its scab. "Would you like to meet Rosie?" Daniel asked gently. Jeremy shrugged. Rosie was a rescued golden retriever, gentle, old, and patient. She approached slowly, sat down without command, and after a few minutes, Jeremy reached out and touched her fur, then leaned in, then whispered something no one else heard. That was the magic Max had left behind, not fame, not applause, a template, a guide, proof that just being there could save someone from the darkest kind of silence. Word of the foundation spread beyond Willow Creek. A journalist from a major city paper visited. She interviewed Daniel, Lily, and several volunteers. When the article went live, titled "The Dog Who Waited and the Town That Learned to Love Again," it went viral. Donations poured in, offers of support, testimonials, therapy dog applications. It was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. Daniel wasn't trying to build an empire. He just wanted to offer something real. A porch, a place, a purpose. One morning, as fall leaves drifted onto the sidewalk, a young woman arrived at the foundation. She looked uncertain, worn from travel. Her eyes scanned the walls, the photographs. And then she spotted the portrait of Max hanging by the memory wall. She stood still, then whispered, "I remember him." Daniel noticed her from across the room. He approached gently. "Did you know Max?" he asked. The woman turned. Her eyes were red, but not from crying. I used to pass your house. 10 years ago. I was just a teenager. Max was always there." Daniel waited. She took a breath. "I used to run away from home. Things were bad. But every time I walked by and saw that dog just waiting, so calm, so hopeful, it made me stop, just long enough to not do something stupid." She looked at him. "I don't know if that makes sense." Daniel smiled softly. "It makes perfect sense." These moments became regular, stories woven with pain, quiet salvation. And Max, a boy who stopped cutting, a widow who finally opened her curtains, a soldier who found peace after years of nightmares. They all had one thing in common. They had seen Max, and in him, they'd seen loyalty that gave them reason to try one more day. Meanwhile, Lily's book went international, translated into a dozen languages, read in classrooms, shelters, memorial services. And Daniel? He was asked to speak at a pet therapy conference. Public speaking had never been his strength, but he agreed. Not for himself, for Max. He took the stage with quiet humility. Behind him, a screen showed a photograph of Max on the porch, ears perked, the door ajar behind him. Daniel began. I once knew a dog who waited at a door for 10 years. Some say he was waiting for a girl who never came back. But I believe he was waiting with her, not for her. He reminded me. And this town, that grief, doesn't end, but love doesn't either. The room was silent. Then someone clapped, and then everyone stood. Back home, the porch remained as it always had, open, quiet, but no longer lonely. Children played on the lawn. Tourists snapped respectful photos. A local artist painted a mural of Max beside the door, tail wagging, eyes full of light. And at the foot of the steps, a plaque read, "He waited, and in doing so, he taught us all how to love." Lily started work on a second book, this time a collection of real-life stories inspired by Max. Jeremy wrote the foreword. He had become a junior volunteer at the foundation and now wanted to be a vet. He wrote, "Max didn't talk. He didn't bark much. But he said everything I needed to hear. That love doesn't die. It just learns how to sit beside you." In quiet moments, Daniel would still walk the porch at sunset. The house was quiet now, but it was full, not of sound, but of memory. Sometimes, he swore he could hear Max's paws patting behind him. Other times, he simply closed his eyes and remembered the weight of Max's head on his lap, the way his tail thumped when Sophie laughed, the quiet that felt like peace. One night, after a particularly long day, Daniel sat on the porch. The stars were bright. The door, as always, remained open, and beside it, a new puppy, a golden retriever named Finch, curled into a ball and sighed. Daniel chuckled. "Big paws to fill, huh?" Finch opened one eye, then closed it again. Daniel sipped his tea, heart full. He didn't need to wait anymore, but the door would always stay open, just in case. The wind was gentler in Willow Creek that winter. It wasn't just the changing season, it was the weight of healing, slow, patient, and real. The town had been shaped by Max's loyalty. Now it was being carried by it. But even in the calm, Daniel was struggling with something deeper, a quiet storm building inside. He still dreamed of Max. Not just memories, dreams, vivid, detailed ones. In one, Max was sitting at the edge of a frozen lake, staring at the reflection of a little girl. Sophie. She was smiling. Max barked once, not out of alarm, but joy. Then he turned to look at Daniel. And when Daniel woke up, his pillow was damp. Grief is strange. It doesn't knock. It doesn't ask permission. It creeps in when your guard is down, during laughter, while pouring coffee in the middle of folding laundry. Daniel found himself waking up at 3 a.m., staring at the door. It wasn't open anymore. It was closed. Just like every other night. But something about that silence felt wrong. Finch, the golden retriever pup, had become Daniel's quiet companion, still young, still clumsy. He chewed shoes, chased shadows, barked at ceiling fans, but he also had this uncanny sense. Whenever Daniel sat too long in one spot, lost in thought, Finch would nudge his hand. He didn't ask for playtime or treats. He just wanted to remind Daniel he was still here. One day, as snow blanketed the sidewalk, Daniel and Lily took a walk through the park. Lily was taller now, her voice deeper, her steps more confident. But she still carried that spark, the one Max had nurtured. They stopped by the old wooden bench near the river, the place where Sophie once tossed sticks for Max. Lily sat quietly, then asked, "Dad, do you ever think Max waited because he knew we needed him to?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He watched the current glide beneath the ice. "I think," he said slowly, "Max waited because he believed in Sophie, in us, in something bigger." Lily leaned against his shoulder. I want to believe in something that hard. Daniel smiled. You already do. The Max Foundation had expanded. There were now 3 branches, each led by former volunteers inspired by the original. One in Seattle, one in Austin, one in Toronto. And each had a similar design. A porch, an open door, a quiet room with a memory wall. The ripple was real, and it was reaching farther than Daniel ever expected. A documentary team from a major streaming platform contacted him. They wanted to film a short docu-series called The Dog Who Waited. Daniel hesitated. He never wanted Max's story to be commercialized. But after long talks with Lily and Aaron, he agreed. If they stayed true to the heart of the story, no dramatizations, no forced tears, just the truth. A camera crew arrived in early spring. They filmed quietly, respectfully. They interviewed volunteers, families helped by the foundation, even Jeremy, now 12, taller, louder, full of light. And then they interviewed Daniel. It was the last day of filming. The director asked, "Do you think Max ever knew what he was doing?" Daniel didn't blink. "I think Max just wanted to keep the door open. And sometimes that's all the world needs. One open door." The series released 6 months later. It exploded. Millions of views, messages from countries Daniel had never even visited. People began sharing their own stories of dogs, cats, birds, even a rabbit who had been their Max. Some had waited by doors. Others had laid by hospital beds. All had loved quietly, fiercely. A woman in Germany sent an email. She'd been bedridden with depression. Her husband had left. Her family had distanced themselves. She found the documentary. One night during a storm, watched it 3 times. Then got out of bed, put on shoes, and walked outside for the first time in a year. She wrote, "I didn't know a dog I've never met could be the reason I choose to keep going." But while the world celebrated, Daniel struggled with something quiet. Guilt. He hadn't visited Sophie's grave in almost a year. The thought of going alone felt impossible, and going with someone felt like a betrayal of the quiet rituals he and Max once shared. One evening, he told Lily. She didn't say anything, she just nodded. And the next morning, she packed a small bag. They drove in silence. 3 hours through winding hills. The cemetery was still. A breeze swirled leaves across the grass. Daniel carried a small wooden box with Max's collar inside. He hadn't been ready to let it go before. Now, it was time. They stood at Sophie's grave. Her headstone still carried the inscription Lily had chosen years ago, "Forever running, forever free." Daniel knelt, tears brimming. He placed the collar gently beside the stone and whispered, "He never stopped waiting, Soph, even when the rest of us did." Lily wrapped her arms around him. No words, just breath and memory and healing. Back home, something began to shift. Daniel no longer stared at the door. He walked through it. He began leading writing workshops for grieving families at the foundation. He taught children how to turn memories into stories, into hope. Finch became a certified therapy dog. His presence, clumsy and joyous, reminded everyone that love wasn't just a memory, it was a promise. One day, Daniel received a letter from a small shelter in Montana. A dog had been brought. In, skinny, nervous, with tired eyes. They named him Scout. The staff noticed he would sit by the gate for hours, staring at the parking lot. They'd seen the documentary, and something in Scout's behavior reminded them of Max. The shelter asked, would Daniel consider adopting him? Daniel wasn't sure. Finch was still young. He'd never had 2 dogs at once. But something about the letter pulled at him. He and Lily drove to Montana 2 weeks later. Scout was older, maybe 8, maybe 10, mixed breed, graying muzzle. But his eyes, they were full of something ancient. When Scout saw Daniel, he didn't bark or wag his tail. He just walked forward and sat beside him, quiet, certain, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. The drive home was peaceful. Scout, curled in the back seat. Finch rested his head on Lily's lap. Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror and whispered, "Welcome home." Later that night, Daniel sat on the porch, Scout by one side, Finch on the other. The door behind him stayed open, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel didn't think about the silence behind it. He thought about the footsteps that had led him here, and those yet to come. Spring arrived with gentler winds and earlier sunrises. In Willow Creek, life continued with its quiet rhythm. Kids riding bikes, neighbors tending gardens, and the soft murmur of porch conversations. But for Daniel, it was the season of remembrance and of discovery. Scout, the senior rescue from Montana, had settled into his new life with surprising grace. He was reserved, unlike Finch's youthful energy, but he had a presence, a grounded, gentle awareness. He'd sit near the door for hours, not anxiously like Max once did, but as if keeping a quiet vigil, as if he knew this home had history. And somehow, he was part of it. One afternoon, Lily came home from school with a crumpled envelope. It had been mailed to the foundation, but addressed directly to Daniel. The return address read, Sheriff Mark Adams, Willow Creek, retired. Inside was a note and a faded photograph. The note read, Daniel found this. In an old box during a move. Thought you'd want to see it. Strange how the past finds its way back. Mark. The photo was taken over a decade ago. It showed Sophie, 7 years old, grinning wide, and Max, tail wagging, tongue out. Behind them stood the old red barn where Daniel used to teach Sophie how to ride her bike. Daniel traced the edges of the photo with his fingers. His throat tightened. It had been years since he'd seen that barn. He hadn't gone back since Sophie passed. And suddenly, he knew what he had to do. That weekend, Daniel and Lily packed sandwiches, water, and a camera. They told Aaron they'd be back before sunset and drove toward the old farmlands, past fences lined with wildflowers and wheat fields swaying like waves. The barn looked smaller than Daniel remembered. Time does that. But it stood barely, weathered and crooked, but proud. Scout and Finch jumped out of the car, tails wagging. Finch chased a butterfly. Scout simply walked to the barn's entrance and sat, as if he'd been there before. Daniel's chest tightened again. Something about Scout was more than just coincidence. Inside the barn, dust motes danced in shafts of light. Old tools hung on the wall. A cracked wooden chair leaned in a corner. And there, nailed to a beam, was something Daniel had forgotten existed. Sophie's name, carved in shaky, childlike letters, next to a heart, and Max's paw print pressed into drying clay. Lily walked up behind him and whispered, "She left a mark everywhere, didn't she?" Daniel nodded, unable to speak. He took a photo of the carving. Later, he'd print it and hang it by the door Max once waited at. Back at home, that photo sparked something unexpected. Emails flooded in from viewers of the documentary asking about Sophie, who she was, what she was like, what she had taught Max. People weren't just connecting with Max's loyalty anymore. They were connecting with Sophie's light. So Daniel and Lily made a decision. They would write a children's book, together, called Sophie's Walk. It would be told from Max's point of view as he followed Sophie through adventures in fields, forests, and dreams, but it would end not with goodbye, but with Max saying, "I'll be right here waiting." Publishing the book wasn't easy. They had no contacts in publishing, but one of the volunteers at the foundation, a quiet woman named Elena, happened to have a sister who worked for a small indie press in Portland. The press loved the manuscript. They printed a limited run, 5,000 copies. It sold out in 72 hours, and the emails came again. This time, from parents reading to their kids, from teachers using it to help children understand loss, from kids drawing pictures of Max with hearts and halos. One girl wrote, in crayon, "I lost my cat Lucy, but now I know she's still waiting by my heart." Daniel cried reading that one. So did Lily. Meanwhile, the foundation was evolving. They introduced a new program, Paws and Pages, grief reading circles for children, with therapy dogs like Finch and Scout nearby to offer comfort. Scout, surprisingly, became the favorite. His calm nature made anxious kids feel safe. He had a habit of placing his head gently on their laps and closing his eyes. One boy whispered, "He listens better than people do." Daniel started noticing something else. Scout sometimes stared at one corner of the main foundation room, the one with the portrait of Sophie and Max. He'd just sit there, silent, focused. Lily noticed it too. Maybe he knew someone like her, she offered. Or maybe, Daniel thought, he remembered. Later that month, a letter arrived with no return address. It simply read, "Daniel, I know this sounds impossible, but I believe Scout belonged to someone I once knew. A girl named Leah who passed away 3 years ago. She had a dog that looked just like him. Waited by the door every day. After she died, he disappeared. I saw your video. I think he found someone else to wait for. A friend." Daniel sat in stunned silence. He stared at Scout, now curled at Lily's feet. Was it possible? Had Scout waited by another door for another child, and then found them? It didn't matter if it was coincidence or something deeper. What mattered was this. Max's spirit wasn't alone. There were others. Other loyal hearts, other silent waiters, other doors still open, and Daniel knew the mission wasn't over. It was only growing. That night, Daniel stood by the porch door. Finch was snoring on the rug. Scout sat beside him, alert but calm. The wind carried the scent of blooming lilacs and the rustle of distant laughter. Daniel whispered, "We'll keep telling their stories." He wasn't sure if he was talking to Max or Sophie or Scout, or maybe all three, but he knew they heard him. As the porch light flickered on and the sky turned purple with twilight, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just peace, purpose. The corner lot behind the Max Foundation had always been unused. It was just an overgrown patch of weeds, vines, and stubborn earth. But as more children came through the foundation's doors, as more families shared stories of loss and healing, Daniel saw something in that empty space, potential. Not for a playground, not for a building, but for something quieter. A memory garden. The idea began with a single question from Lily. "Dad, what if we could give people a place to remember, not just a story?" That night, Daniel stayed up late drawing sketches, not of statues or marble plaques, but of winding stone paths, butterfly bushes, small benches, and trees, each planted in honor of a child or pet someone had loved and lost. Within a week, the Foundation Board approved the project. They called it the Garden of Memory, and the first tree planted was for Sophie, a white flowering dogwood. The plaque beneath read, "She taught us how to love freely and wait with hope." The second tree was planted by a woman named Marisol, who had lost her son to a rare illness. She brought her daughter, age 6, and they planted a cherry blossom tree together. The little girl said, "This one's for my brother, so the birds have a reason to sing." Daniel wiped away tears. So did most of the volunteers. Soon, the community joined in. A man in his 80s brought a cutting from a rose bush his wife had tended for 50 years. A teenager brought a sunflower to plant in memory of her horse, Daisy, and a boy named Anthony, no older than 7, brought a packet of forget-me-not seeds for his baby sister, Ella, who had only lived 12 days. He looked up at Daniel and asked, "Do you think she'll see them from the sky?" Daniel knelt and placed a hand over the soil. "I think she's already smiling." As spring faded into summer, the garden began to bloom. Every morning, Scout and Finch would walk the paths with Daniel, stopping at certain trees as if sensing the stories behind them. Scout, in particular, would sit quietly near a birch tree, dedicated to a teenage girl named Ava who had passed away in a car accident. No one knew why that tree, but Daniel noticed something strange. Each time Scout sat there, a small blue butterfly would land near him, almost always. The volunteers began to call the spot Scout's Watch. Then came the letters. Dozens, then hundreds. People who had seen the garden photos online wrote in, asking to dedicate a tree, a flower bed, or a stone. Some couldn't travel, so Daniel created the Memory Grove, a quiet digital wall inside the Me Foundation, where every name submitted would be etched into a virtual map of the garden. With each name, a short story. Max's story had opened a door. Now others were walking through it. One particular letter caught Daniel's eye. It came from Japan. Written in careful English, it told of a dog named Kiko, who had waited at a train station every day. For 5 years after his elderly owner passed during a commute, locals fed him. Children pet him. He never missed a day, and one snowy morning, he simply didn't return. They found him hours later, curled near the platform where his owner once stepped off. Peaceful, like he knew. The letter ended with, "We believe you're Max, and our Kiko were friends in spirit. Maybe they wait together now." Daniel printed the letter and framed it inside the foundation. That summer, Lily had an idea. "What if we do a lantern walk?" "A what?" "Like, people write a message to whoever they lost. We light lanterns in the garden at night. Let the words float into the sky." Daniel paused. "It might break everyone's hearts," she smiled. "Or it might glue them back together." So they did it. The first lantern walk brought over 300 people to Willow Creek. Local hotels donated rooms. Restaurants provided meals. Families traveled from as far as New York and British Columbia. Each received a small lantern, a strip of rice paper, and a pen. Daniel stood before the crowd that night, Scout and Finch at his sides, and said, "There are some stories too deep for words. Tonight, we let them rise instead." As the sun dipped low, 100 small flames flickered to life. People stepped onto the winding paths, stopping at trees, stones, flower beds. Some cried, some held hands, some simply stood in silence, letting the night speak for them. And then, one by one, the lanterns were released. They floated slowly, drifting on warm summer air, a glowing river of light. Each one carried a name, a memory, a promise. Daniel looked up at the sky, eyes shimmering. He whispered, "She'd have loved this." "Wouldn't she?" Lily nodded. "I think she is loving this." The next morning, Daniel found something unusual at Sophie's tree. A single white feather, perfectly clean. Resting on the plaque, there had been no birds around, no breeze, just stillness. He picked it up and smiled. Maybe Max was still waiting, not at the door, but here, where love bloomed endlessly. It was the first snow of winter when Daniel felt the change. The chill in the air wasn't just from the season, it was in the house too. The morning started like any other. The kitchen was filled with the smell of coffee and the clink of dishes. Lily was getting ready for school. Aaron was packing a bag for the foundation's next outreach event. And Scout, ever loyal, was lounging on his favorite rug, while Finch played by the door. But there was something off about Scout. He hadn't gotten up to greet Lily when she walked in, tail wagging like he always did. Instead, he simply raised his head slowly, then lowered it back down. Daniel knelt beside him, running his hand over the dog's thick fur. Scout's eyes were clear, but there was a softness there, a tiredness. And yet, in the quiet moments, Daniel swore he could still see a flicker of the dog who had waited so long for Sophie. That afternoon, Daniel called Dr. Samuelson, the same vet who had been there for Max and later for Finch after. He joined their family. Dr. Samuelson was gentle, kind, and always honest. When Daniel arrived with Scout, she greeted him with a soft smile. "I've noticed Scout slowing down these past few days," she said. "Let's check him over." It didn't take long for Dr. Samuelson to confirm what Daniel had feared. Scout was nearing the end of his journey. His joints were stiff from old age, his heart weakening. There were no signs of pain, but it was only a matter of time. "He's had a good life," Dr. Samuelson said, "but it may be time for you to decide how he finishes this chapter." Daniel sat silently, looking at Scout, who was now lying on the cold tile floor. He wasn't in distress. But there was a quietness about him that Daniel knew too well. It was the same stillness Max had shown in his final moments. "Give him a few more days," the vet suggested. "Let him go out with dignity." Daniel agreed. That night, the entire family gathered in the living room. Finch, as always, curled at Daniel's feet. Scout laid at the other end of the room, still but content. Lily was the first to speak, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you think he's scared?" she asked. Daniel looked at Scout, who now raised his head with a small grunt. "I think he's ready," he said softly. "He's lived a life full of love and loyalty. I think he knows we'll be okay." The next day, Daniel took Scout on one last walk through the garden. They passed the trees, the dogwood, the cherry blossom, the sunflower. Scout sniffed at the roots of Sophie's tree, then turned to look up at Daniel. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. Scout gave a small, contented sigh and nudged Daniel's hand with his nose. Daniel's heart swelled. The walk was slow, deliberate. No words were spoken. Only the quiet companionship of a dog and his owner, sharing a final moment before the inevitable. By evening, Daniel had made his decision. They would say goodbye tomorrow. The morning was cold and crisp, but the sun shone brightly, casting long shadows over the yard. Aaron and Lily had both said their goodbyes to Scout the night before. But Daniel wanted it to be just him and Scout for a while longer. He let the dog roam the yard freely for a bit. Scout took his time, sniffing the air, walking slowly over familiar ground, as if relishing the moment. And then, when Scout finally made his way to the front door, the door that had waited for so many years, Daniel crouched down beside him. He whispered, "You're free now, Scout. You've done your job. You've kept your promise." Scout turned and looked up at him with those wise, deep eyes, as if understanding everything without words. At the vet's office, the staff was kind. They made the room as comfortable as possible, with soft music playing and a blanket draped over the table. Scout's last moments were peaceful, filled with the sound of Daniel's voice murmuring quietly to him. As the procedure was administered, Daniel placed his hand gently on Scout's head, and for the briefest of moments, he felt the same calm presence he had felt when Max had passed. A presence that seemed to whisper, "It's okay." Afterward, Daniel took Scout home one last time. He buried him beneath the dogwood tree, next to Sophie. It felt right. It felt complete. There, Scout would remain. The dog who had waited by the door for 10 years, now resting in a garden of memories. Weeks passed. The garden continued to bloom, each season bringing something new. A wave of lavender, a swirl of poppies, the deep red of autumn leaves. The lantern walks grew more frequent, and the foundation's outreach expanded. But one thing remained, unchanged. Max's and Sophie's story, and now Scout's, was being passed on to others, those who had loved, lost, and waited. It was no longer just Daniel's story, it was everyone's story. One day, while Daniel was sitting by the garden, a young girl came up to him. She was carrying a small white feather. "I found this," she said. "It reminded me of the story about the dog who waited. I thought you might want it." Daniel smiled, his eyes glistening. "Thank you," he whispered, taking the feather. As he placed it near the base of Sophie's tree, he felt a warm breeze, the kind that stirred the air just enough to carry a whispered memory. He closed his eyes, and in that moment, he knew. Max, Sophie, and Scout were still with him. In every memory, every story, every lantern that lit the night. The seasons turned, as they always do. Winter, with its biting chill, slowly gave way to spring, then summer, and once again the crisp autumn winds blew through the garden. Daniel walked the paths of the memory garden almost every day. Scout's absence lingered, a quiet echo in his heart. But the garden, filled with vibrant flowers and trees planted in memory of those lost, was a constant reminder of what remained. The garden had become more than just a sanctuary for grief. It had evolved into a place where people came not only to remember, but to heal. And as each year passed, Daniel found solace in knowing the names of those who had once been loved and were now honored here. He had given them a permanent place to rest, and in return, they had given him peace. Aaron and Lily continued to help at the foundation, becoming more involved in the projects that supported families through grief. The lantern walks had turned into an annual tradition, growing larger each year, a celebration of life, love, and remembrance. Lily had even started a new project, a mural inside the foundation, depicting the memory garden, with each tree and flower representing a different story, a different life. The mural was a beautiful collage, with faces of people who had passed and the animals they had loved, all woven together in a tapestry of memories. One evening, as Daniel sat on the bench near Sophie's tree, a little girl approached him, holding a small notebook in her hands. She looked no older than 7. "Excuse me, sir," she said shyly. "Are you the one who started the garden?" Daniel smiled and nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I am. I brought this for you," she said, offering the notebook. "It's my story, about my dog, Max. He was my best friend." Daniel took the notebook from her gently. "Would you like to tell me about Max?" She nodded, sitting down next to him on the bench. "My Max was a golden retriever," she began, her voice small but strong. "He always waited by the door, just like your dog, the one in the story. He would wait for me to come home from school every day. And when I came through the door, he'd wag his tail like he hadn't seen me in 100 years. Daniel's heart swelled. "He was old when he passed," the girl continued. "But I never forgot him. And I think he's still waiting for me somewhere." Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. "He is. And he's never really gone, is he?" She smiled, her eyes bright. "No, he's with me in my heart. It wasn't just children who came to the garden anymore. Families, grandparents, even strangers from different parts of the world had come to share their stories. Some would come and sit by the trees, reflecting quietly. Others would share their memories in writing, which was then placed under the flowers or tied to the branches as offerings. And then one day, as Daniel was walking with Finch through the garden, something caught his eye. It was a new tree. At first, he thought it might have been another family's dedication. But as he stepped closer, he saw something that made his heart skip. There, at the base of the tree, was a plaque. It read, "In memory of the dog who waited by the door for 10 years. For Scout, who taught us all what it means to love without condition, from those who still wait." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Lily had arranged it, he realized. His daughter had planted a tree for Scout right next to Sophie's dogwood, in the place where Scout had spent his last peaceful moments. The tree wasn't grand, like some of the others in the garden. It was a small sapling just beginning to spread its branches toward the sky. But it was perfect. And as Daniel sat by the new tree, Finch sitting quietly beside him, he couldn't help but think of all the love that had blossomed in this place. The love that had started with Max and Sophie and Scout. It was the kind of love that never fades. In the years that followed, the garden grew even more vibrant. New trees were planted, new flowers bloomed, and more families came to honor their loved ones. But as the garden flourished, so did Daniel's understanding of the true meaning of waiting. He had waited for so long to say goodbye to Max, then to Sophie, and finally to Scout. But the real gift wasn't in the waiting. It was in the moments they shared, the lives they touched, and the love that lingered after they were gone. As the years went by, Daniel began to write his own story, not just for the garden, but for the world to read. He wrote about the lessons he had learned from Max, Sophie, and Scout, about grief, love, and the incredible bond between humans and animals. His book, titled The Dogs Who Waited, was published when Daniel was in his 60s. It became a bestseller, touching the hearts of people around the world. And through that book, he shared the message that had guided him through his darkest days. Love doesn't end when they leave. It lives. On, in us, in every memory, every shared moment, every whispered story. And one evening, many years after Scout's passing, Daniel sat in the memory garden, now older, but at peace. As the sun set behind the trees, Daniel felt a quiet presence beside him. Finch, older now, had curled up at his feet, and in that soft, golden light, Daniel whispered, "You've all taught me what it truly means to love." He paused, listening to the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. And then, in his heart, he could hear Scout's soft, familiar bark. End of story.